Right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Wilson Center's panel on the new wave of Arab protests. My name is Marissa Khurma, and I lead the Middle East Special Initiatives here at the Wilson Center. One of those initiatives that we've kicked off earlier this year is focused on workforce development in the MENA region. And throughout our research here in DC with economic development experts as well as folks in the region, economic issues, particularly high unemployment rates amongst youth, came up multiple times. Obviously, we know what the data is, but it is definitely a source of great distress for the people of the region. And if we've learned anything from the first wave of Arab uprisings that kicked off in 2011, economic distress, high unemployment, corruption, and the need for change were definitely at the heart of the movements that we've seen. But of course, it doesn't tell the whole story. And so we thought, given the events that we've witnessed this year in 2019, from Algeria to Sudan, and most recently Lebanon and Iraq, that there's a lot to talk about, to try to understand what else is at play here beyond just the economic factors. And so we've convened this panel to have this discussion. I'm delighted to introduce our moderator for today, David Ottaway, who is, of course, a Wilson Center scholar, a veteran journalist with the Washington Post, and a co-author, together with Marina Ottaway, of a new book entitled The Tale of Four Worlds, on basically the Arab uprisings of 2011. I encourage you to pick up a flyer about the book, which has a promotional code right outside, and to read it. And I think it is a very timely book, given that what we've seen, this year with the Arab protests. So I will hand it over to you, David, and to lead the discussion.
Thank you, Marissa, and it's great to have you back. Marissa's been on maternal leave for 6 weeks.
Yeah.
And has a baby girl, Mila.
Mila, yeah.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Glad to see you back.
Thank you.
This is a great topic to be dealing with because it's affecting all parts of the Arab world right now. So this is the second wave of these uprisings, and we have three great experts on various parts of the Arab world to talk to us today about the countries most affected right now by the uprisings. And we have Hussein Abdul Hussein, who's a Kuwaiti Lebanese journalist.
Iraqi Lebanese for a Kuwaiti newspaper.
Iraq.
Yes.
You're not Kuwait. You're not. No.
No.
Working for a Kuwaiti newspaper
Kuwaiti
right
newspaper.
now, Al Rai, but spent a lot of time in Lebanon. So we look forward to hearing your views on that. And next door to him is Rent Rahim, which we have known each other for many decades, and head of the Iraq Foundation. And to her left, my wife, Marina Ottaway, who spent 14 years at Carnegie Endowment for Peace, International Peace, as head of their Middle East program. So I wanted to begin, before I turn it over to the speakers, just to share with you a bit of my own memory of being involved in watching the overthrow of the Sudanese president, Jafar al-Numeri, in 1985. He was on a visit to Washington, asking the United States and the IMF to give him money because they were really in very serious economic trouble, which sounds familiar because it seems Sudan is always in very serious economic trouble. Anyway, he came over here, and I had an interview with him at the Sudanese embassy. This was early April 1985. And we had just come back from being in Cairo for 4 years, so we were familiar with what was going on in the Sudan. And Numeri started the interview by lecturing me about the terrible coverage of the Washington Post of the uprising that was taking place in the streets of Khartoum. And of course, I didn't argue with them, except to point out that we had a journalist there. My colleague John Randall was in the streets reporting on the uprisings. And then we had the interview, and he left the next day to go back home. He got as far as Cairo, and the military said, "Don't come back," and he was overthrown. Now, what was interesting about all this is this is long before social media, and they were able to organize these demonstrations primarily through the professional organizations. We'll hear about them again. They're still alive and doing well, and the labor unions. And the final straw was when the labor unions working at the airport turned off the electricity to the airport so that no planes could land, including Nimeris. And that's how they brought them down. Now, the most interesting thing to me was there was no social media back in those days, 1985, and yet they were able to get the word out and organize themselves, and they did just fine in getting rid of Nimeri without, Facebook and you name it. So many of the tactics that were used back in 1985 in Khartoum, I'm seeing now used again. So just to give you a little perspective on that, you can have these uprisings very well organized without social media. So let's start. Who said? Why don't we just go down? Start with you.
Okay. Thank you, David. I'll try to bring you up to speed on Lebanon, and then I'll give 3 observations, and the rest I'll leave to your curiosity and Q&A.
Excuse me. I'll give you 10 minutes.
Okay.
And if you start going over that, I'm going to give you a warning. You have 2 more minutes.
Okay. That seems fair. After the end of its civil war in 1990, and Lebanon was handed over by the international community to Syria, late President Hafiz Assad, and he built post-war Lebanon on 2 legs. One was reconstruction of the civil war country, and the other one was Hezbollah, which they called resistance because at the time Israel was still occupying South Lebanon. And Assad he skillfully played these 2 elements. He used reconstruction to line up the pockets of his own officers and his own relatives. On the other hand, he used Hezbollah to blackmail the West for any political concessions that he needed at the time. Now, the only problem was that when Israel withdrew in the year 2000, that was the same year that Assad died, Hezbollah became an army without a war, and they became sort of jobless. And 5 years down the road, Assad, because of the Iraq war, of course, and the regional changes, Assad, the son, was forced to withdraw out of Lebanon. So Hezbollah inherited the mantle of the Assads as having the upper hand over Lebanon. And Hezbollah also went to great length to make sure that whatever formula existed in Lebanon remained. That is, the oligarchs would handle what they call reconstruction, which is another word for corruption. And Hezbollah will focus on foreign policy, security, and regional wars. Now, the only problem with such a formula is that eventually the case of perpetual wars will eat up reconstruction. Because money will run out if you invest in infrastructure and no tourists come because there are wars, if no foreign investors come to the country because of Hezbollah's wars, then you're only just spending money. And that's what happened in Lebanon. Lebanon started running out of money, and they tasked their central bank with coming with all sorts of tricks to cover the enormous debt that they were running. The central bank stepped up. It came up with a couple of tricks. First, there was a real estate bubble, and then the banks started hiking interest rate just to soak the market of all foreign currency, which caused a recession. Even so, the country still ran out of foreign currency. In August, Lebanon, for the first time, the central bank was unable to defend the national currency, the lira, which started losing value. So there was a black market and an official market, and that was the first time that Lebanon gets two prices for the lira versus the dollar. When the value of the lira starts going down, it means that people are getting poorer because their purchasing power is diminishing. So people are getting poorer, and the market is in recession. On October 17, the Lebanese decided that enough is enough. They took to the street, and their protests forced the government to resign. Now, the problem is that Hezbollah is trying to preserve the formula and preserve the system, and Hezbollah has been trying to channel popular anger against the oligarchs only, to pretend as if the problem is only with corruption. The thing is, even if the country manages to eradicate corruption, to just eliminate corruption altogether, Lebanon will still face a big problem of attracting foreign investors and tourists, because no investors in their right mind would want to take their dollars and go to a country where war might flare up any minute. So this is where Lebanon is now. There's no government. Protesters are in the street. They're trying to force the president to resign. They're trying to force early election. From where we stand, there doesn't seem to be a solution. I'll just give 3 observations on that we learned so far from Lebanon. The first one is that over the past decades, especially in this town, we came to the conclusion, or in other Western capitals too, we came to the conclusion that stable autocracies are better than unstable democracies. This is particularly after the Iraq War. After the Iraq War and the Iraq War hangover, we reconnected with autocrats, and we thought, okay, maybe they're autocrats and all, but maybe they can just keep things stable. Well, this is falling apart, as we have seen in Syria, now in Lebanon. Iraq is a great example. Other countries in North Africa, autocrats can provide short-term stability, but with a growing population and with increasing poverty, autocracy is unstable, and we have to rethink the paradigm that we've based ourselves on for the past decade. The second observation that I have is, and with all due respect to Professor Francis Fukuyama, identity politics is strong only when people can afford it. So because if you guys have read his latest publication, he argued that he cannot understand how people are abandoning their interest, their economic interest, and selecting identity politics over it. Well, this is not the case in Lebanon. This is not the case in Iraq. In Lebanon, we have seen people who have been fighting for centuries just abandon their leaders. Now, what the oligarchs do is that they need to use identity politics. They need to be racist against Syrian refugees and Palestinian refugees, and then they turn Christians against the Druze, and they turn the Shia against the Sunni, and this is in their interest, because as long as everyone is divided, they can maintain the oligarchy. Ever since October 17, when the Lebanese took to the street, the oligarchy has been trying hard to divide and conquer, except that I'm amazed as someone who grew up in Lebanon, just to see how these Christians, Druze, people who've been enemies for such a long time, they're in the street together, fighting side by side, just asking for a better future. The last observation that I have, and I said we have to rethink how we look at the region. And now, over the past decade, we have observed democracy shrink around the globe. And thanks to China and, of course, Russia, there has been this trend that maybe non-democracies are the way to go. I think we have to rethink this. Arab countries need stability, need democracy. Liberal democracy should get over the Iraq War hangover, and they should start rethinking or reinventing the idea of spreading democracy, not through war, just spreading it the old way that we know: development, aid, training, whatever comes to mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Hussein. You're right on time. In fact, you're early. Ren?
Thank you. Yeah, it works. Thanks for having me. So I want to talk about Iraq, and at some point it might be interesting to compare Lebanon and Iraq. Although I have to say that the Iraqis started first. We started on October 1st, and you followed on October 17th. Right. Also, ours has been much more bloody. I can't keep a strict body count, but I think it's more than 400 dead so far. In any case, you've only had 2.
I hope we don't get there.
No, I hope you don't get there. But so I want to go first into what is driving this in Iraq, and what is driving it specifically in the Shia areas, because this is where the Iraqi protests are happening. First of all over Iraq, there is, in fact, a chasm between the political parties, the ruling elite, people in parliament, people in government, and the rest of the population. There is no common ground, no common understanding, and no dialogue that takes place. And this gap between the population and the political class has been widening. And the biggest indicator of that is the elections that took place in April 2018, which, according to official count, the turnout was 44%. In reality, in Baghdad and the south, it was probably no more than 20%. And the percentage was only hiked because there was a very high turnout, more like 60%, in the Kurdish regions. And the fact that the Baghdad and the Shia areas only turned up at the rate of about 20% is testament to the complete loss of trust of the population in parliament, in the government that could ensue after elections, and in the value of their voice. So this kind of dissociation between the public and the ruling class has been increasing. It has been increasing specifically in the Shia areas, and we can talk about that some more. But if I could give a few sort of markers here. The government, or let's call it the power structure in Iraq, is essentially a Shia power structure. The Shia political parties came to power with, token Sunnis and in partnership with the Kurds to vindicate the grievances and the repression of the Shia. This is, I'm sort of quoting them, that is alleged to have taken place over the last 1400 years, but particularly under the regime of Saddam Hussein. So this was a Shia government, a Shia power structure that came to serve and rescue and elevate the Shia. And so the expectations of the Shia population were extremely high. This was their government now, their state. This is their time to flourish. In fact, what happened was that the southern provinces, one of the southern provinces, Muthanna, in the deep south, is the poorest province in Iraq. Another southern province, Diwaniyah, is the second poorest in Iraq. And we're looking at all of Iraq, including the Sunni areas. Basra, which is the oil, everybody knows, the oil-rich province, is desperately poor. And in fact, last summer, in the summer of 2018, there were huge demonstrations and protests that went on for weeks and weeks in Basra because they had no drinking water. Any water that they received was contaminated. They had no electricity. And obviously, with the rest of Iraq, they shared the problem of no schools, no health system. And in addition, in Basra, the Shia militias were completely in control, and they had their hands on every particular economic sector in the province. So rather than seeing the Shia in the south seeing themselves coming into their own, their situation was dire, and it could be said that it was worsening. So suddenly you have a Shia government full of promises for the Shia population, and a Shia population that has no jobs, no schooling, no economic development, no water, and so on and so forth. And therefore, the disappointment of the Shia in this government is greater than the disappointment of the Sunnis in this government. And companies that have done polling, opinion polling and surveys and so on, have consistently, over the last year or two, since 2017 actually, have found that the approval rating of the government in the Sunni areas is higher than the approval rating of the government by the Shia population. So the Shia feel a definite betrayal of their government of this constituency. The Shia have seen all the political parties, but particularly the Shia political parties, and that includes Muqtada Sadr, that includes the parties led by Ammar al-Hakim, but also the political parties that are led by the Shia militias, as beneficiaries of a corrupt system, beneficiaries of a spoils system that has deprived the Shia population of any goods, services, and benefits. So the anger has focused on the Shia political parties more than on anybody else. And with the resentment against the Shia political parties, there has come an associated resentment against the power that is seen as the sponsor of these Shia political parties, which is Iran. And in southern Iraq, there has been a backlash against Iranian interests that is unprecedented, although we did see it in 2018 and even in 2017. But this time it has been more overt, more extreme, and more laden with risks because it has been so open. So here is the sort of the nexus of Shia political parties, Iran, corruption, spoils, and so on, that has made the Shia population turn against the system. We saw in 2018 Shia militias actually intervening to quell the uprisings or the protests. In 2018, the protests in Basra particularly targeted the officers of Badr, Asa'ib Ahl al-Haq, Nujaba, the party that is aligned with Muqtada Sadr. And this was a very dangerous turn, and these militias then intervened and quelled the protests. This time the protests are much bigger, much more widespread, much more determined, if you want. And it has not been possible for the Shia militias to quell them, not in any particularly effective way, despite the fact that many have been killed. The way that they are handling it is to infiltrate through the Iraqi security forces, under cover of the Iraqi security forces, and use violence against the protesters. But this time around, we really do have a situation of the irresistible force being the protesters hitting against the immovable object, which is the Iraqi state system. The protesters began on October 1st demanding services. Gradually, this demand escalated to a demand to end corruption as being at the root core of the lack of services, lack of reconstruction. But eventually, the nature of the protests and the demands changed. And now it has become isqat al-nizam. We want to get rid of the system. And actually, isqat al-nizam is not an accurate way to describe what they want. They want to change the system, not eliminate it, unlike the protests, for example, in Egypt or say, in Tunis. The protests really are not against the system as it stands. In other words, they still want a parliament, they still want a government, they still want elections and so on, but they want them to be carried out differently. They want a reform of the system rather than an elimination or uprooting of the system. And I think, this may be where we join forces. And of course, the other thing that has emerged very strongly is, I've sort of said and written that the claims or rumors of the death of the Iraqi nationality or identity have been hugely exaggerated, to misquote Mark Twain. A strong Iraqi identity has emerged. And the two slogans are, or the one overwhelming slogan is Nurid Watan. And of course, Watan here does not mean country. It does not mean nation alone. It means a homeland, Nurid Watan. And that the Iraqis now raise the slogan is, I think, a very important turning point in the development of Iraq's history, Iraq's political process, and so on. Okay, I'll stop now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Before I start on the substance, for those of you who are standing, there are some seats up here, You don't have to stand. Okay. I'm going to start talking briefly about whether these protests are different from the protest of 2011 and whether they are more likely to succeed in attaining their aims. I think it's important to keep in mind that the protest of 2011 brought about a lot of change around the Arab world. To me, they really are a turning point. Read the book if you don't believe me. But this strong change, but this change, which is very, very remarkable, is not the change that the protester wanted. In other words, the region changed very deeply, and the protester lost out. Nowhere in the Arab world are the people who protested in 2011 anywhere close to the reins of power. It's essentially everywhere the old establishments came back to some extent. Tunisia is a partial exception, and the emphasis here is on partial. Now, one of the reasons why change has been so difficult, and keep in mind that historically there have been plenty of transition from authoritarian regimes. It's not the transition from authoritarian regimes are impossible. But historically, most of such transitions have taken place in countries where the leadership has been divided, or where there was already a change, a consciousness and awareness on the part of the leadership, what you call the ruling establishment or the ruling elite and so on, that they had to change if nothing else, in order to stay in power, but that they could not continue doing things the way they had always done. Some of the most best studied the transitions were the ones in the Latin American countries in Southern Europe. And let me just take one example. In Spain, Franco, who was the dictator who ruled the country for decades, before dying, had groomed the crown prince to rule in a different way. In other words, he knew he could not change himself, but he knew that something had to change. I don't think we see that anywhere in the Arab world. To some extent, in the Gulf countries, in Saudi Arabia, for example, you see an awareness that they have to change their economic system, that they cannot live on oil forever. And also to some extent that the social customs have to evolve, and hence the driving for women and so on. But certainly no conclusion at all that politics has to change. In other words, so that what makes it so difficult for protest to succeed is that, and I think here I'll quote you, they're running into an unmovable object because the leadership is not ready for any sort of transition. Now, what happened in 2011 is that the protesters in many ways were naive. And so were most people who were watching the protest, because we all got rather carried away about these images of the young protesters rising up and so on. But in fact, they could not really, they were disorganized, they could not become a force for change, able to push against this unmovable force of these regimes that were not ready for change. Is it different at this time? And I am basing my conclusion mostly on two countries, that is on Algeria and Sudan, because those are the ones where you can see the protests that they are started at the beginning of the year, the beginning of 2019. So we have a few more months to see what was happening. And I see two different changes that took place, or two differences. The one is that there is much less naivete on the part of the protester, the people who took to the street. They know how different it is. They know what happened in 2011. And are much more willing to organize for the long duration. You see it in Algeria, where they are still protesting. The Project for Middle East Democracy the other day said they are now in the 38th week of protest. This has been going on for quite a while, and have organized protest in a way that is sustainable. That is, they protest every Friday. They bring out large crowds. Friday is the day off, of course, and people can come and protest, that they can lead their lives and still protest. And they are, most importantly, they are now making it clear that they will not vote in the elections that are scheduled for December 12th. They could not get the government to postpone the day of elections again, but they made it quite clear that they are they will not vote, and they will not, and they will continue protest afterwards. Keep in mind that not voting may be effective in some conditions. Whether it will be in the case of Algeria, I don't know, because again, it's a government that does not want to change. But it is the refusal of South African to vote in 1983 parliamentary elections that convinced the apartheid regime that it was time to give up, and it was time to start negotiating. The second difference is that they are much more willing, and this you see it very clearly in the case of the Sudan, they are much more willing to negotiate with the government. In other words, it's not, we are going to storm the barricades and we'll bring you down. It's more of saying, well, we recognize that we are not going to eliminate you, but is there a process that can bring about a change? And in the case of Sudan, the results have been, at least for the time being, remarkable. I'm pessimistic for the long run, but I think what has happened is that the protesters managed to organize. They had the great, as in, David was talking about 1985, as in 1985, a large component of our protesters were the professional associations. The lawyers' organization, the doctors' organization. In other words, people with a capacity for organizing, with a capacity to come together, not the kids that were in Tahrir Square. And I don't want to look down upon the kids, but the fact is that these were 20-year-olds that did not have much experience. These are professionals with much more experience. And they managed to put together an organization that was able to negotiate with the government and to come to an agreement on a 3-year period of transition in which power is shared between military and civilians. The military is the head of this transitional council right now for 21 months. After that, it's supposed to be a civilian. Going to be a crunch time when the transition has to take place. This military officer going to give up to a civilian. But even under the military, with the military officer as chairman of this transitional council, the prime minister is a civilian. And the cabinet is civilian. And the members of the cabinet were proposed by this civilian council that was put together. So there is a model there of what in the case of the Latin American countries were called pacted transitions. Is Sudan out of the sticks? Not at all, because don't forget that in 1985, the same kind of civilian forces that we see playing a very major role did the triumph, and they did organize election, and they did form a government, and 3 years later, there was another military coup, and it reversed all the progress. So certainly there is no clear path here to success, but what I would argue is that there is certainly a learning curve on the part of the protest movement. That there are certain differences. There is less of an expectation that everything is going to simple. I have not seen, in no country have I seen the protester, when the military flexes its muscles, coming out as the protester did in Egypt, saying the army and the people are one. I think they know better than believing that is the case. So there are changes. Whether those changes are sufficient to really be effective against this immovable force, I don't know, but that's the situation we have now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for staying within the time limit. I'm going to ask them one question, and then we'll throw it open to general discussion. Let me start with Hussein, go down the table. Hussein, one of the problems protesters face is how to continue the protests without their leaders being arrested. And so you get this feeling of leaderless protests. In the case of Lebanon, who is organizing the protests? How are they going about doing this, and are there any leaders?
Well, if you are to believe Hezbollah and its leader, then it's America that's organizing the protests, of course. I mean, that's and Israel, of course. But on a more serious note, I think these protests differ. Iraq and Lebanon have been leaderless, which is not the case in Sudan, which has been more fortunate to have unions who have been leading or at least talking to leaders. But the problem with what's going on in these leaderless protests is that most of the protesters are not really well versed in things pertaining to government and democracy. And there's a disconnect between how they vote and what they expect. And when most Lebanese or even Iraqis go to cast their votes, they're thinking, okay, we will teach these Sunni dogs a lesson because they killed our Imam 1,300 years ago. It does not occur to them that this kind of voting does not really affect the inflow of FDIs and foreign currency into the country, and so keeps them poorer. So what's going on in the protests in Lebanon, the leaderless protests, is that the demands are not focused. And Hezbollah has been trying to co-opt these protests and focus them on the oligarchy so that to deflect attention from the big elephant in the room, which is its armed militia. And so far, many protesters have found in this Hezbollah invitation an easier way. Because the very few days when the Lebanese were shouting, all of them means all of them, and Nasrallah, the Hezbollah leader, is one of them, they were beaten in the street. So they stopped saying that. So they were coerced into changing the slogans and just reverting to the easier ones. And now you won't hear the name Nasrallah in the street anymore. You will see that protesters are clearly avoiding taking on the Hezbollah arms. So what's left is that just to shout against corruption and go against the oligarchy, which is clearly much weaker than Hezbollah. And like David said, the end road of these protests would therefore be, I want the leaders to resign, and I want them arrested, and I want all their money stashed in foreign banks repatriated back to the country. But even if we do all of these measures, Lebanon, the economy will keep on not growing. It'll keep on shrinking. So I think that there's a problem in the basic understanding of protesters of how to be good citizens and how to run a good government.
Ren, you pointed out that this is really an intra-Shiite struggle, the bottom against the top, if you will. Do they really want to the Shiite parties really want to get rid of their leaders? I mean, has it come to that?
Get rid of their leaders?
Their own leaders.
Well, the Shia population does not see the Shia leaders as their leaders. That's the whole point. I mean, they no longer regard Ammar al-Hakim or Hadi al-Amiri or Qais al-Khazali or any of those people as their leaders. Those top people who lead Shia political parties represented in parliament and in the government, they are the very ones that the Shia population is rebelling against and discrediting and rejecting. So, and of course, this is why change is so difficult, because if, in fact, the political establishment were to respond to the protests, they would have essentially giving themselves a pink slip.
Suicides.
Yeah, they would, yes, committing political suicide, although, look, the demands of the protesters have been truly across the spectrum. Some of them say, let's hang them all. And some of them are more measured in their demands. Most of them understand that it's a system and not individuals that they're targeting. But to go back to this issue of leaderless, in Iraq it has been rather regionalized. In other words, the protests in Basra, protests in other provinces in the south, protests in Baghdad. Now, I know people who actually protest in their province one day, then drive up to Baghdad to protest in Tahrir Square the next day. There is that kind of communication, but it seems to me that each province seems to have its own organizational framework. And even though we don't actually know the names of organizers because they're not people we know, they're not the big names that we recognize, but they are people who are working at the grassroots. And they do exist because occasionally we get, for example, a statement from the organizational committee of the Qar or the organizational committee of Maysan, which are two of the provinces in the south. So that tells us that there are, in fact, committees or informal groups that are trying to put some order into this creative chaos. But they're not names that are well known. But that's not necessarily seen as a bad thing because, as you mentioned, the possibility of reprisal by the government is very high and has actually started. I think since last week, the number of arrests, abductions of leaders has risen, and we've seen it go up. It has existed, but in the last week, it has sort of escalated, and every day we get new names of people being taken in by the armed forces. Armed forces, by the way, I'm using it loosely because there is the army, there's the police, the local police and the national police, and then of course there are the more nebulous, unknown militias who have entered into the formal armed forces but who continue to owe allegiance and take their orders not from the Prime Minister or from the Defense Minister or from the Minister of Interior, but from the heads of those militias. And the amazing thing is that repeatedly we have heard the Prime Minister say, you know, we've ordered all the armed forces not to use violence against the protesters. We've similarly heard the Minister of Defense, similarly heard the Minister of Interior. And so the assumption can only be that people who are in uniform, using the resources of the state and under the cover of the state, are going after the protesters, either killing or now detaining more than killing and abducting. So there's a sort of a kind of a fog of war that is enveloping the whole situation.
Marina, you pointed out in Algeria, the protesters have been very careful to avoid conflict. And in fact, I think only one protester has been killed, and I think it was a heart attack, not from because of the police. But my question is, after 37 weeks of protest, or 38, have they had any success? Are they getting anywhere, or is it a deadlock, or has the military backed down at all? What's happening there?
Well, I think right now they have a stalemate because the protesters won't go off the streets, but the military is not backing down. They still will hold the election. To me, the turning point, the crucial point, the crunch, is going to come with the December 12th elections. If the protester managed to withhold the vote and to get enough people not to go and vote and continue the protest, then the military has to decide where they are going to go from here, because the military now is counting on the elections solving the problem. Now we have a legitimately elected government, and therefore, order will be reestablished. If order is not reestablished, then I think the military has a choice. Either they are going to use force. The Algerian military has a bad history in terms of using force. This is an extremely violent country. And it's a miracle that so far there has been no violence. I mean, this is a country that became violent during the War of Independence and has stayed violent ever since. The 80s were the 90s were an incredibly violent period in the history of the country. So given this past of recurring violence, it's a miracle that so far things have been peaceful, that the only death, as David said, there was a poor guy who died of a heart attack during the demonstrations. I think after this December 12th, the government has a choice, essentially. Either it's going to crack down and really to turn to violence, or it's going to start talking to the protester. The problem is that so far the protesters have not been able to come up with a credible organization and with a credible spokesperson. They have tried. They have approached various people, professionals of constitutional law, etc., prominent personalities who in the end decided they were not going to do it, that they were not going to put themselves forward in this situation. I mean, my final words is watch what happens on December 12th, because that is when we know the answer to the question.
Okay, open to the floor. Go ahead, lead off.
Hello, Rend. I really appreciated your erudite remarks, but my question is going to be for Marina. The reason we can call this a second wave is because the protesters in Sudan and Algeria deposed two longstanding leaders, Bashir and Bouteflika. So they've accomplished something. But other than that, we've had constant protests in the region since 2011. I mean, in Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia alone, we have over 9,000 protests annually for 8 years now. So we're in a waves upon waves. Sometimes it goes national, sometimes it's regional, sometimes it's micro-protest across many of the countries of the region. A lot of it micro-protest, sometimes it gets big. Now, every Sudanese activist I've spoken to tells me privately, we took a bad deal. Elections postponed for 3.3 years. Hemeti gets to keep all the gold. The ex-Janjaweed supposedly investigate themselves, but they won't. And we're kicking the can down the road with a pretty bad deal. All the Algerians protest leaders tell me, aren't we smart? We didn't take a terrible deal like the Sudanese did, but we and we'll be able to outlast the regime. But as we all know, they may not be able to outlast the regime. And I agree with all of your analysis. My question is, deal or no deal, right? Is it better to take the Sudanese type deal and try to make a pacted transition, even though the institutions were a lot weaker in Sudan than Tunisia, for example? Or is it better to take the no deal, play a long game, keep your protests pure? And from that perspective, I would suggest, to help you start the answer, there are learning curves, but not learning curves here. There's still a will for a kind of leaderless protest that can't be cracked down upon.
I think I think the question is too broad. I mean, it's not a question of deal and no deal. First of all, is a deal possible? I don't think in the case of Algeria, so far a deal has been possible. They tried and nothing came. I cannot tell you whether I'm sure that there are people who in the Sudan who think they took a bad deal and that 3 years is not enough. Keep in mind what happens if you have elections right away. That if you have elections right away, it's the same old parties that come to power because nobody else has had time to organize. And in the case of the Sudan, it means the Ummah Party and the DUP, which are attached to the Sufi Brotherhood. So it's the same people again. It's, I think they narrowly missed getting Sadiq al-Mahdi once again as a prime minister. So, I cannot tell you which one is better, but it's a very abstract question. I mean, you do what seems to be, these people are doing what seems to be possible under the circumstances. And, people in the Sudan who took the deal will tell you we are better off than the Algerians, who so far don't seem to be getting anywhere. So,
Hussein and Ren, is there any deal on the table that they could even accept a quarter of a loaf or a half a loaf? Ren?
So far, no. What we have to talk about, what are the elements of the deal, right, of a possible deal. And I think that the core demands that could constitute a deal are elections within, say, 6 months, but that presupposes a new election law, a credible election commission, and the election law really has to be to not depend on the large political parties and so on. It has to be on an individual basis. In other words, like other election systems, say here or in Britain, that there are individual candidates, because a lot of people see that the old system, which depended on the lists put together by political parties, is unrepresentative. So an election law that is more representative, closer to the voice of the people, a credible commission, election commission, a revision of the political party law. These are the sort of some of the core demands. Another core demand that has come up is a real and transparent investigation of what happened, who killed, who maimed, and I think this is a major demand. And then, of course, fighting corruption. Now, any or all of these are going to shake the political establishment. And although there are now circulating in Iraq drafts of a new election law, but the government still has not come to terms with these several demands that I just enumerated. I don't think there can be a deal unless the government and the powers that be recognize that these are non-negotiable demands, and that some of them may take longer, some of them will, for example, a revision of the Constitution will undoubtedly take longer, that there should be a time horizon for each one of those, but they all should be met. Those are the core elements of a deal, and I don't think we're there yet.
Hussein, is
Yes,
there a deal imaginable?
Well, let me say this: deal over what? What's the end game for everyone? I don't think anyone realizes that the end game is not really that good for anyone, and that's why they start going after the old regime or corruption, or start to be creative. To my mind, any deal would have to grow the economy, and I don't see many people talking about this. I mean, when the Lebanese Civil War ended, Rafiq Hariri, who was the prime minister and was later killed, his basic idea was to grow the economy, which should work for everyone. Make out of Lebanon something that's similar to the Asian tigers. So now that's a deal that someone should fight for. What you see in Iraq and Lebanon and other countries is just a reshuffle of names. We will keep on reshuffling names, electoral laws, you name it. The result will be the same. You need some people with some insight who can step up and say to the Iraqis especially, and then to the Lebanese, but the Iraqis have a misconception about their country being the second richest in the world. And I heard this when I was growing up as a little kid in Iraq. Iraqis think that the biggest oil country is Saudi Arabia and the second biggest is Iraq, and that automatically translates into Iraq being the second richest country in the world, which is not the case. And you have to explain to these people, the government will not give you jobs, it will not give you housing, it will not give you all these things. The government can level the play field so that we can grow an economy and make it go. So the problem is whether in Iraq or in Lebanon, I mean, even if you manage to get these leaderless group of people into one cohesive movement with someone who can talk on their behalf, this someone who'll be talking on their behalf will be saying, okay, I want this guy put in prison. I want this new electoral law. And even if we do these things, like you said, we'll end up getting 9,000 protests over the coming 2 or 3 years.
Yes, the lady back there at the end of the table.
David, can I?
Oh, just a minute. Yeah.
I think in Iraq, what Hussein said is not only true, but it's further exacerbated by the fact of oil revenue. Because it is so easy to co-opt kind of key individuals. There is money, of course, it's all taken in by the corruption and by the political parties, and that applies to the Shia and the Sunnis and the Kurds, not just the Shia, by the way. But one of our problems, and I don't know, I mean, Lebanon in that sense is in a slightly better place. We have a lot of money slushing around, which is actually utilized to silence people. And that has become an additional problem that we face.
Back at the end of the table there.
Hi, thank you for a lovely panel today. I'm curious about one factor that I believe Marina brought up about that perhaps previous protest movements had not reckoned with, the military factor. And so I'm curious what you think it would take for the military to become not a roadblock in sort of this movement for progress, or will it forever be an issue? If you were to write a playbook for what a successful protest in the Middle East would look like.
Well, first of all, when you say previous protest, I'm not sure which did not have to face the problem of the military. I don't know which countries you are referring to, because certainly in a lot of Latin American countries you had the military governments. I think in terms, let me put it this way. I think a military that has been in power at some point or another, could always come back into power. In other words, you cannot rule. That's why I think the pact in the Sudan is so fragile. What's going to keep the military from doing what they did after 1985, when they came back in. So in that sense, it's difficult to eliminate it. I think the military is likely to step aside if they realize that they cannot govern the country as it is, and they decide that it's better for them to step down essentially and let somebody else do it. I don't think there is any kind of transition that can eliminate once and for all the possibility that the military will intervene again. And perhaps that is the luck of Tunisia. I think one of the reasons everybody holds up Tunisia as the success story, which to some extent it is and to some extent it's not. But Tunisia had the great fortune of not having a politicized military and having a rather weak military. But otherwise, I don't think there is... the military may step aside, but not necessarily forever.
Hussein, you want?
Just in the case of Iraq and Lebanon, if you want to understand the role of the military and the militias, you have to understand the model that's in Iran. And when there was the Iranian Revolution, the Iranian revolutionaries were scared that the army was still loyal to the Shah. So they started creating these militias, which we call today the Republican, the Haras Thawri, IRGC. Revolutionary Guard, thank you. So this is a structure that's not really in the government, that really belongs to the supreme leader, and that competes with the army. The same thing, they copied the model in Lebanon and now in Iraq. Hezbollah is the most formidable power. It's stronger than the army, and it's outside any government control, and it takes its orders from Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian leader. And they're trying to replicate the same thing in Iraq. So the military in Iraq and Lebanon is not really as instrumental as countries of North Africa.
I just to add to the answer. In the case of the Sudan, since they became independent 1956, the military, in fact, did step aside twice. And you had civilian governments. They made a mess of it. They couldn't deal with the economic problems, and the military came back. So we have seen, at least in Sudan, I can't think of any other examples quite, where the military, but it did happen in the Sudan, and the outcome was not good. Yes, next question. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you all for sharing your time. My question is about the Levant. And my understanding from my research is that there are way too many conflicting interests in the Levant, and that maybe differs it from, say, Algeria or Sudan. The conflicting interests are internal, regional, and maybe more so pre-Trump globally. And so if you agree that these conflicting interests contribute primarily or are a prime factor to the lack of economic development, the corruption, the lack of leadership, how can we disentangle these conflicting interests? Iran, Saudi, Turkey, Russia, US, and so on. And if you don't agree, if you think it's just the people incapable of finding their leaders and Why? Can you elaborate on that? How do you feel that these conflicting interests regionally are not contributing?
Who would like to take a stab?
I'm happy to do so. There certainly are influences in this region. I mean, and whether we're talking about Lebanon or Iraq, both of them are certainly subject to regional interventions, pressures, international pressures, and so on. In Iraq, obviously, the two contending parties are Iran and the U.S., and that's very obvious. Although the Saudis have an interest, the Emiratis have an interest, the Syrians have an interest. So the problem is, look, I find this a bit of a specious argument because it is up to Iraqi or Lebanese political leaders to make a choice. You either want this pressure, welcome it, or buckle under it, or you stand up to it. It doesn't seem to me something that is, there's nothing deterministic about it. There is a choice that people make. And if they make the choice to allow interference, then interference will happen. Now, interference happens most easily in a weak state, and Iraq is a weak state. Lebanon, I would argue, is a weak state.
Has always been.
Has always been. And the weakness of the state, of state institutions, the lack of a national program, a national vision, a kind of solidarity around what, by the political elite, of what we want Iraq to be and where we want Iraq to go. The lack of this consensus is what creates the fissures that allow interference and interventions and threats and carrots, sticks and carrots, which is what Iran uses all the time. So it is not the fact that our neighbors and people outside have an interest in Iraq or an interest in Lebanon. It is to what extent the political system allows these interests to interfere in the decision-making of a particular government or the particular state.
Marina?
Yeah, I'd like to add something that it's, I mean, yes, the local actors, the government, the various political forces have a degree of choice. But I think in some of these countries, and I think Iraq to me is a clear example, and so is Lebanon, is that the outside forces are embedded in the political system. In other words, it's not, Iran is an outside force, but Iran is, embedded into some of the political party and is embedded certainly in many of the most important militias. So that it's a bit, you cannot quite say, well, you can choose whether or not to, for them to be involved because they are part of the domestic system. And you are absolutely right. That makes the situation much more complicated, and so it is.
Hussein, you have.
Well, let me say these dividing the nation, dividing a people into its subnational identity is one of the good tools for the oligarchs. And you use your own, say, the Sunni against the Shia, you consolidate your position. Now, the problem with subnational identity is that it can also become transnational. So the Shia of Lebanon and the Shia of Iraq should be connected to Iran, and the Sunnis should be connected to Turkey or Saudi Arabia. Now, this goes both ways because the Iran is using the Shia as a transnational identity and therefore winning allegiance from the Shia of Lebanon. But at the same time, the Iranians are losing the allegiance of their own Sunnis. and the Sunnis become a fifth column against the ruling establishment. Just how the Shia in Saudi Arabia become a fifth column with Iran against Saudi Arabia. So what happens when you use these subnational identities is that you're effectively canceling the borders. Now the problem arises when you erase the borders. This does not work well with the configuration that we have, because national debt is national. When the Lebanese lira is losing value, everyone is losing value. Whether you're Shia or Sunni, you're just losing your salary. So I think this is the entanglement that's happening. And I just said that in Lebanon, we see some sort of change. We see the Shia, the Sunni, the Christians, and the Druze, who are all bitter enemies. They're coming together on the street just saying, that's it. We just want a national government that can take care of national debt and work, somehow make the economy work for us.
Let's go to this side. Sir, go ahead.
Sure, thanks for doing this. I know the title of this was The Wave. I'm just curious, two parts really. Is this a wave that stays in Iraq and Lebanon? When you think about 2020, are there other places in the region where you think this same kind of phenomenon could crop up? And just step back a little bit more broadly. It strikes me, we've had a protracted period of unrest in Hong Kong, Chile, Spain. I recognize they're very discrete catalysts and accelerants for each one of these protest environments we're in, but is there anything that you think is overarching that you kind of stitch these all together and say there's something underlying that's going on that's feeding this change?
Well, maybe I can try to answer. I mean, first of all, when we talk about the wave, we are talking about Sudan and Algeria as well. That is all the movements that started during 2019, but that's just a footnote. We don't really understand very well what is the contagion effect. I mean, we know, for example, in 2011, that the Tunisian uprising very clearly influenced the uprising in Egypt. You just had to talk to the organizer. I mean, they were very explicit about it. They were following the example. To what extent has, Algeria or the Sudan really influenced the demonstration in the Levant? I don't know. There are other different worlds. I don't know if people in the Levant ever looked in particular at Algeria and the Sudan. In terms of the fact that we have, you are right, that essentially there is a worldwide trend right now. I think it's very different to know what a contagion effect is. I think there are the same underlying conditions that lead people to march in the streets. That is, these are countries that have political systems, even if they're nominally democratic, they're formally democratic, where the leaders are out of touch with the population, essentially, and therefore there are these uprisings. Why does it happen all at the same time? Yeah, probably there is some contagion effect. I mean, there is the history of Europe. 1848, the whole of Europe went up in flames. And by the way, just as a footnote to David's comment about social media and the importance of social media, one explanation of why all those uprisings were taking place in Europe in 1848 is that it was all the fault of the newfangled invention called the daily newspaper.
Okay, we have to let's take a number of questions, and if you all will jot down which one you'd like to reply to. Oh, yes.
I'd just like to ask the panel, it seems that many people would agree that these revolts and uprisings end up flatlining or failing because of a lack of, as Mr. Hussein was saying, a common voice, a banner under which the protesters can rally, and a figure who can speak for the masses and say, okay, what we really want is economic prosperity, a chance at a real life. And it seems to me, and perhaps Egypt in the aftermath of 2011 is a classic example, that there were no democratic institutions to absorb what happened in Egypt after that. And so there was a failed Muslim Brotherhood government that never really took off the ground. And then there's the economic distortion that's now being caused by the Egyptian military. So if the panel would like to address a rather broad question, what would your prescription, say, be for countries that don't have the chance to create democratic institutions? And it seems that the protests are 2-3 steps ahead of this process. That is a very long-term process and needs to be in place first before we can actually take to the streets and say, we demand change. Because every time the people take to the streets and blood is spilt, we come up empty-handed.
Okay.
I know it's a broad question,
Okay.
but
Let's get some more questions, and then sir, go ahead.
Thank you for this interesting panel today. I was in Lebanon as recently as October 1st, and I have to make a shameless confession. I've been looking at my phone the entire time, and the protests there have in fact intensified since our session began this morning. So my question, I think, is mostly for Hussein. What is happening at the level of the civil administration in Lebanon? We hear about the resignation of Hariri and the demands of the protesters going forward, but we don't hear much about what is happening with, for example, the judiciary. Are the courts functioning?
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, my question is about one of the speakers talk about the Asia tigers and China model to try to solve the economic problem. So my question is, this use the Asia tiger or China model, they only refer to the specific economic policy for some kind of policy, or more overall for our economic system, or even broader for our governance system, political system.
Okay. Do you want? Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. I'll start because this just talk about the world trend. Why is this happening all over the globe? And I think the two governing systems that we have, liberal democracy, and the other one is a hybrid of autocrats, mainly those with old revenue who use old rent, like Rand said. It's a slash fund. You use it, you co-opt some, the main figures, and you rule. And this works only when the population is, small to medium size, and your income is high enough to keep things rolling. Now, the problem that's going on, especially in Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, is that the population is becoming much bigger. Corruption is becoming much bigger, and the dollar is not just going for everyone. Some people are falling in the cracks and are falling into poverty. And the only way that these autocrats know how to deal with them is either just buy them more, and this has been the essence of the speech of the Lebanese President Michel Aoun, is that we will dig for oil, we will start selling oil, just give us a chance. So they either pay you money or they beat you brutally, like what's going on in Iraq. There's no third way. And I think and this applies to other countries too. I don't think Iran is stable. I think if Khamenei leaves and there's no a good alternative, this will hit Iran. Russia will go back to pre-Putin after Putin. And this is mainly because for the same reason. And when we say the Asia tigers, we mean, I don't think China, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think China is an Asian tiger. And I think many people in this town who are experts on China, I'm not, but they think if the economic growth starts tanking, then we might see a different China. Then the social stability will be shaking and repression will go up. So this is the basic thing that's going on, and it's hitting the Middle East hard because reliance has been on oil for such a long time. Now the population is big. Now, just to go back to the Muslim Brotherhood question, it just goes back to the idea that people on the street do not really understand what they're asking for. They know what they don't like. They don't know what they want. And what the Muslim Brotherhood did, or if we look at the government in Libya, the first thing that they did was that they canceled civil marriage, and they started instating Muslim practices in government as if this makes things easier for the economy, which it doesn't. So Muslim Brotherhood just came in and came out, and there was no difference. Only the economy kept on tanking. So you're right. There are no institutions, and I think the only way forward is that for the liberal democracies around the world to stay focused and keep on investing in building the capacity of these nations. Not, because I think the Iraq war was really bad, but what was worse than the Iraq war is the way that we, America, managed it, because we just copied the regime in Lebanon, we copied it in Iraq. And the Lebanese regime was failing anyway, so we just copied a failing system into a failing country. So that's my take.
Yeah, Hussein, I particularly appreciate your last remark because whatever one thinks of the war, it is what happened in the aftermath of the war that ruined Iraq. But I want to mention something about social media also. And this idea of a contagion. Of course there is, and I know that in Iraq the protesters and particularly actually I was going to say particularly the intellectuals, that's not true. I have seen protesters talking about Sudan, maybe not Algeria, but it's very interesting. They are aware of what's going on around the world, certainly in Iraq and possibly in Lebanon even more so. I think what is happening with the social media and so on, and this is quite apart from the protests, is in Iraq you have a new generation who has access to all the social media plus cable TV and so on and so forth, and they are able to travel now, of course. They want to be part of the world. They want to be like other young people. Recently, some young men were arrested in Anbar province because they were wearing Bermuda shorts, which were regarded, they were regarded as, immoral. But these young people have seen Bermuda shorts. They wore Bermuda shorts because they want to be like everybody else, all the other young people in the world. The other thing that social media has done is it has educated people. And when I look around at what the protesters are saying, not just the intellectual elite in Baghdad, but also around the provinces, people who are, without degrees, they have educated themselves about the Constitution, for example. They've educated themselves about the election law. They know how the political party law functions to their detriment. What we've seen over the last several years, actually, and this year is the culmination only, is a much broader awareness of the political system, of what these institutions should do and what they are in fact not doing, what all these instruments of the so-called democracy mean, what they're supposed to deliver. So I think this has been an important role for social media and not just incitement and organizing.
Marina, final words?
Okay, I'll try to address two of the issues. The first one, let me start with the Asia model, right? The Asia model is both an economic and a political model. That is, it's an economy guided by the government, not necessarily totally controlled by the government, but certainly guided by the government. But that requires a very strong government, and then the relatively authoritarian government that can really give a direction. So it is both. I think for most Arab countries, the Asian model cannot work because at this point in most Arab countries, you have governments that are authoritarian, but not necessarily strong in terms of being able to control, to guide to develop an economic policy and to implement an economic policy. Now, in terms of I am not going to address the issue of what's happening to the civil administration in Lebanon because I'm not the right person. But in terms of the question concerning, what's the advice to these countries, you cannot organize. There is no way in which the opposition can develop democratic institutions if the government in power is an authoritarian government. So that essentially, I think the the answer to being effective, as far as I can tell, for the protester is to organize themselves. I mean, there are three ways in theory, right, and being very schematic, in which this protest can end up. One is the one you said, the flat line. That's a very nice expression, unfortunately. In other words, they get nowhere, right? The second one is they ended up with some sort of compromise, whether you want to call it a pacted transition, transitions that don't really satisfy anybody completely, but they lead to something which is somewhat different from what was there before. I mean, I would say both Tunisia and Morocco, to some extent, are an example of this. The young people that took part in the demonstration in Tunisia are extremely disillusioned. There is a lot of, despondency there, but some change took place. And the third one is revolution. And revolutions are few and far between. And I would say, thank God, because the outcome of revolutions is not a democracy. The outcome of revolution is usually a regime, look at Russia and China, that certainly in the initial phases, I'm not sure that it's worse than what was there before, but it's certainly not better than what it was there before. But both a negotiated transition of a revolution require organization for the protester, in fact, to get somewhere. It's very interesting that, Lenin had it right. You really need a strong organization. And it's very interesting to me that you remember years ago when right after the 2011 that we all thought that the Muslim Brotherhood was going to take over the world because they were organized. And in fact, if you know a little about, if you see the studies of the Muslim Brotherhood, they are a very Leninist organization, not in terms of the ideology, but in terms of how they are structured. They really understand the importance of organization. So, in the Tunisian transition, it was the UGTT and other organized groups that had an impact.
We need to wrap up.
I'll rest my case.
Yes.
Quickly.
Just sorry, I missed the civil administration question. It's just the state in Lebanon is really in full decay. And if you look up the constitution and read it, it'll read as if it was written by a third grader. Now, the language is weak, and it's optional anyway, because the president of the republic should consult parliamentary blocks within 10 days. It didn't happen. They kept the country without president for 2 years, against every constitutional article in the constitution. So I don't think the political establishment cares much about the constitution, and this reflects all the way down. So the administration is just like a turf of this or that oligarch. And I don't think anyone at this point, because the big chiefs, Nasrallah is a cleric, and Aoun is a former general, and Hariri is a businessman. There's no people who understand the constitution or public administration who are running anything in Lebanon, or who are being hired to fix or run anything in Lebanon. Well, I mean, it's just
not the garbage.
Yeah, I mean, it's not. It's because the EDL, Électricité du Liban, it runs a yearly deficit of 2 billion in a country whose annual budget is 14 billion. So it's just they're throwing money on some, and electricity is not there most of the time. Well, they are, but political sway over them is really huge. Unless your political oligarch sponsor tells you which way to go as a judge, you'll never go, because you risk your personal safety is at risk. If you lose protection of the oligarch, then you're out not only as a job but even physically. So
thank you. I think you all have really defined the issues, even if you haven't given all the answers, because nobody knows where this is going. But I really want to thank you all for sharpening and focusing on what are the issues.
Just try.
Thank you, David.